Several years ago, my wife and I used to tune in faithfully to watch a TV show called Friday Night Lights. It was a weekly television show that was based around a high school football program in Texas. In that show, Coach Taylor, the head coach of the Dillon Panthers, had a saying that he used to close each practice with and break each huddle with: clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose. So that was the motto for their football program, to stay focused and give their all to the football team. It's also the lesson that we learn from 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 8 through 23. And for us personally, we will see today that clear eyes spiritually and full hearts towards God will make all the difference in the world and in our outlook on life, even when it seems that there is no escape from the enemy. How many of you can see clearly through spiritual eyes? Some of you can answer, yes, I see things from God's perspective most all the time. But I bet many of us would have to say that when things get tough, maybe even hopeless, that it's hard to see God's hand moving. Oh, we know what to say. We know in our mind the right things. We know that God's ways are higher than our ways. And if we keep our eyes on Him, He will provide, things like that. Have you ever felt confused as to why the things are happening around you like they are? Maybe you're even wondering where God is in the midst of your pain and in the midst of your trials. Your mind and your words know what to say, but your heart feels lost and confused. If that sounds like something you have gone through, or perhaps you're even going through right now, or maybe you know somebody who's going through this that you might be able to help and minister to, then my prayer is that the truths that we learn today in this message will open our eyes to see things the way that God sees things, and to see God's hand at work, just like Elisha's servant did in this story that we're about to study, when they were surrounded by the enemy with no help for escape. Let's set a little backdrop for this story. You see, the king of Aram was warring against Israel, and all things being equal, he should have defeated them easily. But every time he came up with a great plan and a battle, God would reveal to Elisha what the king of Aram's plans were. He would warn the king of Israel. They would be ready for it. For obvious reasons then, this king of Aram got pretty upset with Elisha and decided he was going to do everything he could to destroy him, to kill him, to get rid of him, so that he could easily start winning the battle. So one night, he took all of his army full of men and horses and chariots and surrounded the village that Elisha and his servant was staying in. Let's read what happened when Elisha's servant woke up in the morning and realized their entire village was surrounded by the enemy and they weren't going to get out. When the servant of the man of God got up early the next morning and went outside, there were troops, horses, and chariots everywhere. "Oh, sir, what will we do now?" the young man cried to Elisha. Elisha's servant sees what's surrounding them, and he's afraid. They have horses and chariots and men. They have more bad guys than good guys. In fact, they had an entire army of bad guys, and then there were only the two good guys, Elisha and his servant. Do you ever feel something like that? Do you ever feel that way? That the deck is stacked against you? Your finances are a mess. Your job is terrible. Your family is falling apart. You have no friends to encourage you. You have physical ailments that are tearing you down. You name it. From your perspective, things are not looking good. Just like Elisha's servant, you see the enemy surrounding you, and there doesn't seem to be any relief in sight. Well, let's read on to see what happened. "Don't be afraid," Elisha told him, "for there are more on our side than on theirs." Then Elisha prayed, "O God, open his eyes and let him see." The Lord opened the young man's eyes, and when he looked up, he saw that the hillside around Elisha was filled with horses and chariots of fire. The Apostle Paul puts it another way when he writes, "That is why we never give up. Though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. For our present troubles are small and won't last very long. Yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever." So as Christians, if we have those spiritual eyes available to us, why do we still see trouble surrounding us and have trouble seeing things from God's perspective? Why did Elisha's servant not see God's army surrounding the enemy army? Today we are going to look at a few reasons or obstacles as to what is keeping us from seeing with spiritual sight. And I promise that once we see what it is about our focus that continues to keep us from seeing things from God's perspective, despite our best efforts on the contrary, and then we let one simple truth transform our whole way of thinking, then we will no longer be like Elisha's servant, wondering how we are going to make it, but we will see, like Elisha did, that the armies of God around us are so much stronger than the armies of the enemy. Now, I don't mean that we're just going to believe that truth. I think most of us already believe that God is stronger than the enemy. But we are going to begin to see that truth living out in our lives. So who is this enemy that surrounds us and keeps us from seeing with spiritual eyes and keeps us from double portion living? Ephesians 2:1-3 gives us an explanation as to what it is that wars against us, trying to keep us from seeing victory in our lives. "Once you were dead because of your disobedience and your many sins. You used to live in sin just like the rest of the world, obeying the devil, the commander of the powers in the unseen world. He is the spirit at work in the hearts of those who refuse to obey God. All of us used to live that way, following the passionate desires and inclinations of our sinful nature." This passage gives us three truths as to what keeps us from seeing with God's eyes. Truth number one is we cannot see things from God's perspective when we focus on the world around us. We focus on the world in two different ways. The first one is kind of obvious, but still needs to be addressed. Many Christians today never come close to experiencing double portion living because they desire the world and what it has to offer. Things like prosperity, power, or prestige. If only I could drive a better car, live in a bigger house, get that promotion to a higher job, have better kids, have a better spouse, whatever. So many Christians are driven by the same desires that the world has. And we do everything we can, focusing all of our energy on reaching those worldly milestones, but never attaining to that spiritual double portion living that should be the desire of all Christians. But God tells us to focus our energy on one thing, and that is pressing on towards the prize of the calling that Christ has called us into. We'll be discussing what all that means and how to do that in a future series called Pursuing Your God-Given Dreams. But for now, we must realize that we will never reach those dreams that He has given us. We will never reach double portion living as long as we are focused on the things that the world has to offer. There is a second way that Christians focus on the world, and unfortunately for many, this one is not as easily seen and is not as prevalent in messages in churches as the first one was. But I can tell you from personal experience that this one sometimes bites you as hard or even harder than if we simply just focus on the things that the world has to offer us. There are obstacles in the world that when we focus on them, we fail to see things from God's perspective. Just like Elisha's servant failed to see God's army surrounding the enemy army. Those obstacles to our faith are different for every person. For some, it's a financial obstacle. For others, it's physical. It might be a relational obstacle or perhaps a mental or an emotional obstacle. But I think we all have seen in our lives obstacles that get in the way of our faith. Oh, we know in our mind that God is bigger than those obstacles. But what we know theologically doesn't always transfer to what we live practically. Oh, now that's a good truth here. That's kind of deep, so let me say that one once again. What we know theologically doesn't always transfer to what we live practically. That was a free pearl of wisdom for you. No extra charge. It wasn't one of our truths that we're talking about today. It's just extra. I hope you got something out of that one. But it's true, isn't it? We don't always live out what we really believe. Where the Bible says that we will know the truth and the truth will set us free, we don't live that belief out. Why is it that we know the truth, but we're still living in bondage to the world? We still focus on the obstacles that the world puts in front of us when God says that we are free from financial obstacles and from physical obstacles and from relational obstacles and emotional obstacles and mental obstacles, or any other obstacle that might be keeping you from double portion living. Am I preaching to you now? Is this hitting home with anyone? Jesus says we are free from these obstacles. We are free. Yet we still aren't living the double portion life because we are acting just like Elisha's servant did. We are focusing on the world around us. But before we discover how to change our focus, let's continue looking at a couple more things that deter us from seeing with spiritual sight. Oh, I know for many of you, we could stop right now and say, Steve, you've already hit me. Now give me the solution. Don't just tell me that I need to change my focus. Show me how. I need to know how to change it so that I can live that double portion living. Bear with me for a few minutes and I promise it will be worth it. So let's look at truth number 2 now. A second reason why we fail to see with spiritual eyesight. We cannot see things from God's perspective because we have an enemy warring against us. Elisha's servant could not see the army of God because he was focusing on the enemy around him. The Bible tells us that Satan is like a roaring lion seeking people to devour. He comes to us to steal, kill, and destroy. Friends, Satan is alive and well on this earth, and he is working hard to destroy Christianity. He is working hard to destroy you and me. Sometimes he does it by attacking us physically, sometimes mentally, sometimes emotionally, sometimes spiritually. He knows what our weakness is, and he likes to attack us at our very weakness. So where you are most vulnerable, that's where he's going to attack. The good news is that we don't have to fight Satan alone. Actually, let me rephrase that. We don't have to fight him at all. All we have to do is abide in Jesus Christ, stay in constant communion with him, and let him fight the battle that he's already won. In other words, we need to take our focus off of the enemy and start focusing on God to start seeing things with God's eyesight. And again, we'll talk about how to do this when we talk about this whole paradigm shift in our way of thinking, and we'll do that in a few minutes. But let's look at the final area that draws our attention away from God and onto obstacles around us. And I have a feeling that this one's going to really hit hard and hit home with some of you. It certainly did with me. Truth number 3 says, we cannot see things from God's perspective when we listen to ourselves. The Bible talks about the world, the flesh, and the devil conspiring against us to keep us from living the abundant Christian life, to keep us from double portion living. We have discussed the world and the devil Now we're going to discuss the flesh. Now, I know most of you who know your Bible and have grown up in church are immediately thinking of the flesh as your sinful nature. It's what the Bible calls the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. You are already thinking that I'm going to start talking about our sin nature and how it's the sin in our life that keeps us from seeing things through spiritual eyes, and in turn keeps us from experiencing double portion living. And you're right. That's very true. We do need to stop sinning, and we do need to stop giving into those things that might easily entice us. But I want to focus on this part, on something that isn't talked about so much in church. For me, one of those things that kept me from experiencing double portion living and kept me from seeing things with spiritual eyes was myself. No, it wasn't any big sin I was living in. It's not something that I did or that I didn't do. It was who I was listening to. You see, I was listening to myself, my own weak, insecure self, that every opportunity there was would take that opportunity to remind me things like, I am worthless, I am a failure, no one respects you, no one even likes you, you have no friends, your life is a waste, it's a failure. I am a failure as a husband. I'm a failure as a father. I'm a failure as a friend. I'm a failure as an employee. I'm a failure as a minister. I'm a failure as a person. I'm a failure as a Christian. How many of you ever listened to that voice inside of you? I mean, I know nobody has that voice as negative as mine is, but how many of you have some voice inside of you always reminding you of your past sins, of your past failures, of ways you don't live up to expectations? And each time you start to make progress in your life, something happens to remind you that you really can never experience double portion living because you have always failed in any particular area. Or worse yet, sometimes other people subtly or overtly remind you of your past failures. Am I hitting home with anybody right now? Do you ever feel like you just don't measure up to the expectations that others or even you yourself have of you? I bet if you take a minute to breathe and think about it, most of us would realize that we often have those negative thoughts. And we focus on our past, and we focus on our failures, and we focus on ways we don't measure up. And that is why we cannot see things with spiritual eyes. We cannot see things from God's perspective. And instead, we see the enemy surrounding us with no hope for escape. And the worst part about it all is that when we do talk to ourselves and remind ourselves of our failures and our shortcomings, we're usually right. The enemy really is surrounding our city. We really are worthless and a failure. You see, Elisha's servant wasn't imagining things. The enemy really was there, and in our own self, we really are all those things that we tell ourselves we are. But you see, Elisha saw something different. When his servant pointed out the enemy army surrounding the village, Elisha looked up and he saw on the hillsides surrounding the enemy chariots of fire. And that brings us to truth number 4. And this is that revolutionizing truth that will open our spiritual eyes. Despite our failures, Christ in us can see from God's perspective. Let me explain what I mean. Hold on to your seats here because for many of you, what I'm about to say might be a totally brand new thought for you. We talked about all the reasons that we fail to see through spiritual eyes. And the simple truth is, we cannot help but see through physical eyes. We cannot help but see the obstacles that the world puts in front of us. We cannot help it that Satan likes to steal, kill, and destroy our lives from reaching that double portion living. We cannot help but listen to our own voice reminding us of all the failures that we've had in the past. And to make it worse, we tell it to ourselves in first person. I am a failure. I am no good. I don't live up to expectations. I am this. I am. And the truth is, I am. I am all those things. But God isn't. Remember when Moses and God met at the burning bush, and Moses asked God what his name was, and God told Moses that his name was I am. Now I know we always think that when God said his name was I am, he was referring to the fact that he was eternal. He was the same yesterday, today, and forever. He never is I was or someday I will be. He always is I am. I am eternal. And that's true. But it also goes beyond that. God is the I am for everything that we need and everything that we aren't. I am your provider. I am your comfort. I am your hope. I am your protector. I am your love. I am. God is I am. So when I start reminding myself that I am a failure, I let God remind me of who he is. I am your success. When I start reminding myself of my past sins, I let God remind me that he says, I am the one who forgives. When I start reminding myself that I am worthless, I let God remind me that he says, I am worthy. God is the great I am. But Steve, how does that change who I am? I mean, I know that God is the great I am, but that doesn't mean that I'm all that great. I'm still worthless, and I'm still a failure, and I'm still all of that. Well, let me take you to another story with Moses. Remember when he went up into the mountains and God wrote the 10 Commandments on tablets of stone? Well, one of them said, "Thou shalt not take the Lord thy God's name in vain." Remember that one? You know, we've probably all been taught growing up, if we grew up in church, that this means we shouldn't use bad language. And some of us were taught we shouldn't say things like, "Oh my God," or "Jesus Christ," if we weren't praying to him or literally talking about him. And all that's very true. But I think perhaps it goes a little bit deeper than that, and it might be something that you've never thought of before. Let me give you an example to help illustrate my point. On October 7th, the year 2000, a young woman named Amy Hughes stood next to me on a freezing, rainy, windy day in front of hundreds of our friends and family. Fortunately, we were not outside, and we were inside of a church auditorium. On that day, she took my name, Biddison. With that act of taking my name, she immediately became an owner of a house that I had bought several years earlier. That house was now hers, and several months later, we sold it for almost twice as much as I had bought it for. But I didn't make that profit. We made that profit. We did. Without putting a dime into it, she received the blessing because she had taken my name. Now let's go back to that commandment that we just talked about. Do not take the name of the Lord in vain. What if Amy would have said, "I know I am the owner of this house, but I don't want to partake in the blessings of living in the house, and I don't want to partake in any of the profits of when we sold the house." For the sake of this illustration, she would have then taken my name in vain. It was worthless in this situation for her to have even taken my name. So as Christians, the moment of our salvation, we enter into God's family. We take His name. And what is His name? I am. So who are we now? I am. Not that we're God, but we have His name now. And despite everything that wars against me, I am loved by God. I am forgiven. I am worthy. I am more than a conqueror. I am faithful. I am successful. I am able to stand against the attacks of the world, the flesh, and the devil. I am blessed by God, not because of who I was, but because God is the great I am. And I took His name, and I will not take His name in vain. I will live the double portion life. Amen? So here we are at the close of this great series on the life and ministry of Elisha, the series Double Portion Living. And here we stand just like Elisha's servant did. Where are you going to choose to focus? It's so easy and it's so natural to focus on the world, the flesh, and the devil, and to drive ourselves crazy with discouragement because we cannot see God's hand surrounding every aspect of our lives. But instead of focusing on the obstacles that hinder our faith, focus on God as the great I am. I know for me, I've never had problems believing God can do something great. My faith in God has always been strong. But where I have struggled was not believing that God can, but believing that God will do it to, through, or for me. I mean, why would He? I have messed things up too many times in my life, and I'm pretty worthless. But when I started to understanding the power behind the truth that as a Christian, I have God's name, and now He doesn't want me to take that name in vain. When I started realizing that, I have been more at peace with myself than perhaps at any other time in my life. And as a result, I have begun to experience double portion living. And that's my prayer for each one of you too. May you put all these truths that we have learned in the 7 messages in this double portion living series, may you put them into practice, and may you start to experience double portion living as God surrounds you with His love, fills you with His grace, and captures your heart.